And and secondly, to introduce Tony. Tony Daniels is well known under his own name, but also under his pseudonym of Theodore Dalrymple, where he writes in various newspapers and magazines like the Wall Street Journal. He is a former prison doctor, but he's also a doctor more generally, but he's also somebody who has made one of his hobbies, the extraordinary one, of visiting terribly dangerous countries and very odious tyrannies and writing back extremely amusingly about what goes on there. So whenever there's shooting going on, a revolution, a war, you will find him sending back enormously witty accounts of it. On this occasion, of course, he's lived in countries in which he's seen the results of foreign aid at first hand, but he's also, as a friend of Peter Bauer's, recognized Peter as a wider social critic, somebody whose insights were not purely economic, as indeed no economists are, but he was somebody who had a range of insights which aren't captured by economics. And so I'd like to invite Tony, who exemplifies the same attitude, to give us the talk.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, first I'd like to thank the Danube Institute and also the Bank of Hungary for having invited me here, especially as I have no credentials whatever to speak. But as we've heard, that might actually be an advantage rather than a disadvantage. I hope it's not inappropriate for me to tell you how I came to meet and befriend Peter Bauer. Peter used always to say to me that he was particularly proud to be the only member of the House of Lords in Britain who was the son of a Budapest bookmaker. And that was his great achievement. He used rather perhaps in an unorthodox fashion to say that Mrs. Thatcher had two great achievements, and the first was the destruction of the power of the unions in Britain, and the second was her appointment of him to the House of Lords. As you know, I'm just a doctor, and I'm not an economist or an historian, and Peter actually wasn't interested in health, at least not his own, and whenever you inquired about it, he brushed aside with impatience the whole question as being uninteresting. He said, well, I'm blind, I'm deaf, I'm lame, but that is perfectly normal. I actually had worked in Tanzania, which was a country that was almost a blueprint, or the blueprint, for all that Peter thought was most inimical to economic development, and illustrated best and most clearly the politicization of life that foreign aid promoted. While I was working there, I had, under an assumed name, published articles about my observations of the country. And it should be remembered that at that time, Tanzania was largely regarded as a shining beacon for Africa, if not for the entire world. And its leader was called Julius Nyerere, who was known locally as Mwalimu, which means teacher, which is slightly more modest than Nkrumah in Ghana, who was actually the redeemer. Well, Mwalimu was only the teacher, and he was widely admired because of his apparently modest manner and lifestyle, and his supposedly virtuous policies. And because of the high critical regard in which he was held at the time, Peter used to call him St. Julius. But what had teacher taught, and what were the miracles performed by St. Julius? Well, there were several things that I noticed, and the first was the astonishing poverty of the country. Where I was working, everyone was dressed, man and woman, in women's cast-off overcoats, which were provided by charities, European charities. And there was nothing to buy. almost nothing to buy. The currency was called by the local people pictures of Nyerere. They were quite good pictures, actually, rather good. And in a country of poor people, everyone was thin, with the exception of members of the Party of the Revolution, who inclined to be portly. And talking of primitive accumulation, I remember a Mr. Comber, who was a low member of the party, who used to keep his bribes in his woolly hat. And I can remember him running away when someone gave him a bribe, and he put it very quickly in his woolly hat and went off. So you could tell a member of the party by his girth. Every 10th household had what was called a 10-cell leader, a man whose permission or certificate of political reliability was necessary to obtain almost anything. For example, permission for his child to continue at school. And I don't think it will surprise you very much to know that this became a system of bribery that reached into the tiniest interstices of life. But it did create, in conditions of general penury, a cadre of people who were not only the eyes and ears of the regime, but loyal to it for the small advantages it gave them. And one might think here of Freud's phrase, the narcissism of small differences. No doubt this may bring happy memories back to Hungarians of a certain age, I don't know. Well, Nyerere was very adept at talking the language or rhetoric of left-wing European intellectuals while blinding them, which in all conscience wasn't a very difficult thing to do, to the natural consequences of the forcible collectivization of peasant agriculture and the removal of millions of peasants from where they were living, from the land on which they were living, all on the supposition that it was only thus that equal and equitable development could take place while the government provided the population with its inestimable services. Well, the maintenance of this system required tyranny and corruption even on a micro level. I had a patient, an Indian trader, who had contracted tuberculosis in a Tanzanian prison, to which he had been sent for 6 months during one of Nyerere's so-called economic crackdowns, conducted by the army to search out people who had supposedly dealt on the black market, which, of course, Peter would have preferred to call the open market. My patient was one of a class of admirable people who were small merchants who'd begun their careers by bringing a few simple consumer trade goods into remote places in Africa at a time when to do so actually risked being attacked by lions and other wild beasts, who were, of course, not as dangerous as the government, but that's what they did. And he had been found, this trader had been found in possession of 6 cups and saucers for which he did not have the receipt. For this terrible crime, as I have mentioned, he spent 6 months in a less than salubrious jail, and he got TB, and the person who arrested him got 6 cups and saucers. I could, of course, continue. It's obvious to me that it was foreign aid that facilitated this iniquity, paid for it all, in fact. And I was, in my own small way, a beneficiary of it. I bought my first house with the proceeds of British foreign aid to Tanzania. So it was not all entirely wasted. Well, the collectivization was predictably such a disaster economically that there was, of course, only one solution to it, which was more foreign aid. And 90% of the population lived on the land, but this was still not enough to feed the 10% that lived in the cities. There were practically no cash crops being grown because they were subjected, if grown, to almost forced requisition by state marketing boards. So the peasants actually tore up coffee trees and other cash crops. Nyerere himself recognized the nature of his system, perhaps implicitly, perhaps explicitly, when he explained why he refused to devalue the currency. He said this would have destroyed his powers of political patronage, for of course access to foreign currency at the official exchange rate favored persons, and was a way of ensuring their loyalty to him. And it allowed them, of course, to live at an incomparably higher level than other people in that society. And I would lose everything I have. These were Nyerere's precise words, which I read almost with disbelief in the country's one English language newspaper. Well, I met Peter at a lunch at The Spectator, and I think he was pleased to come across someone who had written so frankly about the sainted Julius and his miracles. And one has to remember the zeitgeist of the time, because even then, and especially among his peers, there was a great deal of hostility to Peter, and there was a great deal of friendly feeling towards St. Julius. Peter was not merely regarded as mistaken in his ideas about the Third World and its development, but he was thought to be wicked. He had some kind of devilish disorder, which no doubt would now be in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, that caused a deficit of generosity and warm feeling towards the impoverished of the world. Well, until I met him, really, I hadn't given 2 seconds thought, or not connected thought, to development economics, and I therefore read some of his books, which interestingly were much harder to find and obtain than were those which were 2 a penny and to be found in any good bookshop, that took the view that the rich were rich because the poor were poor, and not in any merely definitional sense, but in a causative sense. For the authors of these books, not only property, but wealth itself was a kind of theft, was theft. And yet the problem for them was not where poverty, the problem for them was where poverty came from, not wealth. For them, to adapt very slightly Rousseau's great dictum, man is born rich, but everywhere is poor. If my recollection serves me right, Peter was taken to be some kind of neoliberal apologist for multinational companies, a man who thought that laissez-faire was the answer to all problems. And this seems to me to do him considerable injustice. Though he did, of course, believe in free trade and a liberal economy, he was certainly not a believer in an abstract homo economicus, far from it. The undifferentiated man who considers only his narrow economic interest, which he calculates with perfect rationality, did not exist for Peter. He did not think that in a world in which restraints on economic life were removed, if one were able to envisage such a world, differences between individuals and groups would disappear or die out. For it is part of his thought, something that he repeated over and over again, that different people and different groups of people react differently to similar economic circumstances and incentives. Not even the same monetary incomes result in the same outcomes in other respects. Income is not all. And I hope you'll forgive me if I once again refer to an African experience of mine. When I was a very young doctor, I worked for a very short time in what was then still called Rhodesia. And unlike South Africa, black doctors in Rhodesia were paid of the same amount for the same work as white doctors. There was no income differential, few as they were in number. And here was a puzzle. Why was I able on my salary to live in great luxury and even save money when a black colleague paid exactly the same wage, lived almost in squalor, and could hardly make ends meet? It certainly had nothing to do with his personal affinity for squalor, and I'm afraid it took me a rather long time to work out the explanation, which was really very simple and obvious. While I was able to devote my entire salary to myself, I had no parents, no brothers and sisters, no nieces or nephews, no village to support. And my money was entirely my own to dispose of as I wished. My black colleague's salary, being exceptionally large for his group of people, had to support a very large number of people: parents, siblings, an extended family, and so on. He would have been regarded as a very bad man indeed if he had refused to share his salary in this fashion. And in fact, it would have been virtually impossible for him socially and psychologically for him not to have shared his salary in this fashion. Now, in this social obligation to share, there was something admirable and very good. You couldn't just dismiss it as a bad thing. But it had its harmful effects too, especially in the light of what was about to develop in Rhodesia. And these bad effects were going to manifest themselves very, very clearly. It was perfectly fine when people in the situation of the Black Doctor were not part of a small class of people in charge of the country, and when government service was not the only means of personal advancement. In other words, when an economy was open and the government did not seek to regulate economic life in its entirety. But people like my colleague were a very small elite indeed, no doubt largely by their own efforts, though also supported by the sacrifices of their families. And soon, this class of person was to take over the running of the country. Needless to say, they understandably wanted to live at the level of life that the previous ruling class or elite, of which I was a small-time member, lived. The near squalor in which they had previously lived was not something of their choosing or something that they wanted. But their inherited social obligations remained. Anyone who did not do the maximum he could for his family or his village was either a fool or, much worse, a very bad man. No conceivable salary, in the ordinary sense, would have allowed the elite both to meet its inherent and deeply felt social obligations, and at the same time lived at the desired level of which was that of the previous elite or ruling class. Bear in mind also that the new political masters, in the name of egalitarianism and social justice, concepts that they had absorbed actually from a Western-style education, and which they manipulated, I must say, with cunning and ease, both for internal consumption and external consumption, sought to control economic life ever more tightly, such that effort was diverted into obtaining and retaining political influence as the precondition of mounting and keeping commercial enterprises and obtaining wealth. And this is precisely the kind of thing that would not have surprised. In fact, Peter Bauer would have predicted. When you put all this together, the result is obvious and not at all surprising. In such an economy, dearth really does become a source of wealth for a very tiny proportion of the population. The only way to have averted this outcome would have been to maintain limited government. But that was always politically unlikely, given the hegemony, or at least preponderance, of the ideas that Peter Bauer dedicated his life to fighting against. how far a limited government is compatible or incompatible with an authoritarian government, or actually requires some kind of democracy, is a question that I will leave to others. But certainly a highly regulatory government run by an elite that simultaneously wants for itself the fruits, but not the tree, of past Western economic and technological progress is bound to result in stagnation or something worse than stagnation. In other words, Peter, and I hope I'm interpreting him correctly, would have said that an open economy without much central regulation or planning would have been a necessary condition for African development, which was precisely the opposite of what was recommended by most of the experts of his time, who believed that only central planning and forced saving, together with subventions from foreign aid, could provide the capital that they said was necessary before any economic development could take place. Here, let me add in parenthesis a curious inversion of the truth that took place in the minds of intellectuals and opinion formers in the West. Those who favored central planning and its inevitable extortions of the kind that I have described, bear in mind that we saw millions of peasants in Tanzania moved by force from where they were living. People who believed in that kind of thing were thought to be those who cared most for people, for ordinary people. While Peter, who always had a very deep respect for the capacity, and a genuine respect for the capacity of African peasants and farmers to respond to demand for cash crops and make rational investment decisions for themselves, without, of course, theorizing about it, and which he had seen for himself in his early researches, was depicted as a kind of hard-hearted, callous, devil-take-the-hindmost, Gradgrindian, dismal science kind of economist who cared only for profit and not for people. But if a liberal, or at least liberalized economy was a necessary condition of economic development in Africa and elsewhere, was it a sufficient one? And the answer to that question, of course, depends rather on what you want or expect economic development to achieve. If you want from economic development, if what you want from economic development is social justice in its usual modern acceptation, then the answer is clearly no. By social justice is almost always now meant equality of outcome or equity. Equity is also usually confounded with equality of outcome, though it is clearly completely incompatible with such equality, at least as long as people make differing efforts in different fields, with different abilities and differing goals. Incidentally, it may interest you to know that the words equality and equity are used interchangeably now, routinely, in medical journals. They are one and the same thing. Equity and equality are one and the same thing. This is surely an instance of what Peter used often to lament, at least to me, and I'm sure to many others here, the apparent inability of people, despite great intellectual or technical sophistication, to think connectedly about quite simple matters, whether, for example, equity is the same as equality. Over and over again, Peter stressed the differing qualities, aptitudes, and desires of people, both as individuals and as groups. There was no possible way, short of extreme force, in which outcomes between different groups of people can be equalized or smoothed out, and therefore in liberal economies, and probably even in illiberal ones for that matter, because egalitarianism is very rarely, in fact never, carried out equally, differences between groups, often very large, will persist. And this is a perfectly normal thing throughout history, and will remain so short of genocide. Superficial or demagogic egalitarian objections to spontaneously generated differences have brought us such delights as Nazism, the slaughter of the Chinese in Indonesia, and the expulsion of Asians from East Africa. So Peter's thought, I think, was not unidimensional. And let me mention here that he did not even think that economic development was necessarily an unequivocal good, that people ought to aim at it single-mindedly and have regard to nothing else. This is because there is rarely gain without loss, and people may, with reason, care more about their losses than their gains. It is conceivable that and he would use this example, it's conceivable that attachment to the holy cow in India has at times retarded economic development. But only a monomaniac would be prepared to violate the sentiments of the great mass of the Indian population in increasing the GDP by 1 or 2 points by killing holy cows. That is, this is, of course, impossible in any case. The political consequences of the mass slaughter of the holy cow would retard economic life. If one were to learn that the construction of skyscrapers in the Vatican City would promote Italian economic growth, who, other than a barbarian, would advocate it? Of course, there are many such barbarians, unfortunately. In short, I think Peter would agree with an aphorism that I've adapted slightly from Tocqueville. He who seeks in economic development anything other than economic development itself is destined for economic stagnation. Now, of course, Peter recognized that most people prefer to be rich rather than poor, comfortable rather than uncomfortable, economically secure rather than insecure, and that most of them believe that economic development will give them the benefits that they seek. But man is not only a problem-solving animal, he's also a problem-generating and desire-creating animal as well. And it seems to be a fact of human psychology that no sooner has one desire been satisfied than another arises in the mind, and past satisfaction no longer satisfies, but is taken immediately for granted. For example, I cannot remember, just to give a very small example, I can hardly remember what life was like before the internet, although I've lived most of my life without the internet. We cannot go on forever being grateful that we have and will always have enough to eat, when throughout much or most of human history, having enough to eat was an exception and a privilege rather than a fundamental assumption. Can I go on for long being euphoric that the infant mortality rate in India has now fallen to what it was in England when I was born? Incidentally, this vast improvement in India's infant mortality rate can also be presented as a deterioration. This is one of Peter's great insights. Because infant mortality rate in India was only 5.4 times higher in England in 1949 than England's in 1949, the year in which I was born, while it is now 9.4 times higher, which can be presented as a relative deterioration of 42.5%. And Peter was always aware, much more, I must say, than most economists in the field, and I'm not an economist, but I think I'm allowed to criticize economists, of how statistics can be, and often are, used to create a completely misleading impression, usually for lobbying purposes, and how statistics do not speak for themselves, but have to be interpreted or mined for their meaning and their true use. Peter's view of development, then, was not a simple economistic one. He ascribed great importance to history, to culture, to psychology. And these things, of course, themselves do change. I'm talking about psychology and history. And if I may quote yet another personal example. My work in an inner city hospital in England led me to come across large numbers of asylum seekers. And whatever their motives for coming to England, they were certainly enterprising and daring people. They often entered the country in containers or tied under trucks. They'd hazarded dangerous border crossings. And this was the interesting thing, they could be turned in matters of weeks by enforced dependence into the kind of people who complained of the size of their television screens in their lodgings, or how they could not get to their English language classes because free umbrellas had not been provided. These are people who had come 2,000 miles risking death. This transformation could happen within weeks. Thus, Peter's view of the reach of development economics was essentially modest, though not the less sophisticated for that. It might tell us something about the necessary conditions for development, few very simple necessary conditions, but the sufficient ones were different. In assessing any country and its prospects, it was necessary to have an appreciation of its history, culture, and psychology. And wealth is neither nothing nor everything. There is no single measure of life, not even GDP per capita. And Peter always enjoyed, I think enjoyed is the word, though always within the bounds of truth, revealing supposed wisdom as folly, knowledge as ignorance, compassion as cruelty, and orthodoxy as absurdity. He saw in his lifetime his ideas, as we've heard, going from being dismissed as wrong and cruel to being accepted as so obvious and self-evident that their enunciation was hardly worth the effort. But no victory is final, and I think that Peter's beautifully expressed strictures, so beautifully expressed that even a non-economist such as I can understand them with ease, will remain salutary for a very long time, alas. Thank you.
Yes. If you'd stand one side. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we're going to have to go straight to lunch without allowing you to subject Dr. Daniels to an inquisition. But the opportunity to do that will undoubtedly come later, so we look forward to it. In the meantime, let me just say what a sparkling talk that was, informative, going very deep, and yet absolutely wonderfully easy to swallow. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.